The factory's in the red. That's what my kids kept saying. But at the exhibition, those same pieces were selling for $20,000. That's when I realized it wasn't just paperwork lies. My own family had been living a double life behind my back. When the lawyer read the will, my name came up in a way I hadn't expected. The factory, our little jewelry factory, the one my husband poured his hands and soul into, was now mine. I sat there with the paper spread out before me, the ink barely dry. The air in that office smelled of coffee and dust, and yet the weight of it pressed down on me heavier than anything I had carried in 69 years. "Mom," my eldest said, leaning across the table, his voice almost rehearsed, "this isn't good news. The factory is drowning. Debts piled to the ceiling. It's a burden, not a blessing." My daughter chimed in before I could answer. "We should move quickly, before the creditors close in. We've already drafted the liquidation papers." They slid the folder toward me, smooth and practiced like waiters setting down a menu. I stared at it but didn't touch it. The factory was not just a business. It was the place where my husband's laugh used to echo, where the workers greeted him like family, where he used to come home with gold dust still clinging to his cuffs. He used to sketch at the kitchen table, lines sharp and certain, before taking them to the workshop. He believed every piece of jewelry had to have a story, even if it was only a pair of earrings. And here sat my children, my own flesh and blood, telling me to sign it all away. "Mother, you don't understand," my youngest said with a sigh that made me feel like a schoolgirl again. "The books are a disaster. We've covered the losses ourselves more times than you can imagine. It's hopeless." I wanted to ask why they hadn't told me sooner. Why had they carried this supposed weight alone? But the look on their faces wasn't concern, it was urgency. As though the ink on those liquidation papers burned hotter with every second I didn't sign. "I'll need some time," I said finally, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. My son gave a tight smile. "Of course. But don't take too long. Every day costs money we don't have." That evening I drove past the factory. The building squatted there, brick walls weathered but sturdy. The old sign with my husband's name painted in careful letters was fading, but it still caught the late sunlight. I parked and just sat, staring through the windshield. I could almost hear the clang of tools, the whir of polishing wheels, the smell of metal and wax drifting into the street. For a moment I was back in 1967, standing at his side as he told me about his dream. A workshop where ordinary people could wear a piece of art. The shutters were drawn now. The yard was quiet, but the place still stood. Back home, the folder waited for me on the kitchen table. I set the kettle on the stove, listening to it whistle as I flipped through the pages. Numbers, red ink, columns of losses, all screaming the same thing. Worthless. My children's notes were clipped inside. Short sentences, direct, urging liquidation. I ran my fingers along the edge of the papers, but something in me resisted. A burden, yes. But wasn't it also memory? Legacy? That night sleep refused me. I lay in bed with the weight of the past pressing down, my husband's face floating before me. He had died believing in that factory. Could I really let it be buried so quickly? The next morning my daughter called. "Have you signed yet?" she asked, her tone brisk. "Not yet," I replied. Silence stretched on the other end, sharp as glass. Then she said, "Mother, you don't want to drag this out. Trust us, we know the numbers. It's over." But something inside me stirred. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was love. All I knew was I couldn't let go. Not yet. So I placed the folder in the drawer, pushed it shut, and whispered to the empty kitchen. Not yet. It was a Saturday, one of those crisp mornings when the air smells faintly of rain though the sun shines bright. I had gone into the city with no purpose but to walk. Sometimes when my thoughts grow too heavy, I find it helps to let my feet carry me where they will. The streets were alive, children tugging at balloons, vendors calling out about roasted nuts, the clang of a streetcar bell. I turned a corner and saw banners strung across a row of buildings. Annual jewelry exhibition. My heart caught. I almost kept walking, afraid of what I might feel, but my feet slowed then stopped. The letters seemed to call to me. I stepped inside. The exhibition hall was all glass and marble, buzzing with people in polished shoes and perfumes that lingered in the air. Display cases sparkled under bright lights, each one carefully arranged, guarded like treasures in a museum. I wandered slowly, my hand brushing the edge of each glass case, letting my eyes adjust to the dazzle. Rings glowed like captured stars. Necklaces hung like frozen rivers. Then, my breath stilled. In the third case near the back I saw a pendant. A simple oval with a twisting design along the edge, delicate and balanced. I knew that curve. My husband had drawn it on a rainy afternoon decades ago, his pencil scratching across the kitchen notepad while soup simmered on the stove. He said it reminded him of the vines that grew wild along the fence in our backyard. I had watched him take that sketch to the factory, turn it into silver and stone. And here it was again, gleaming under exhibition lights. I leaned closer. The placard beside it read another name, a company I had never heard of. But the piece, I could never mistake it. It was ours. I moved on, my chest tight. At the next case I froze again. A bracelet, slim and intricate, with tiny flower-like links joined together. My husband had stayed up nights refining that design, cursing softly when a link broke, smiling wide when the pattern finally held. He had given me the first one as an anniversary gift. Mine was tucked away in a drawer at home. And here stood its twin, labeled as the work of strangers, priced higher than a year's wages. I clutched the glass edge for balance. The crowd moved around me, men in suits pointing, women in hats tilting their heads to admire. None of them knew the truth, that these jewels carried the sweat of men in my husband's workshop, the laughter of the women who polished them, the stories of our family. Further in I found more. Earrings shaped like tiny leaves, his design. A brooch with interwoven lines, his sketch. Piece after piece, familiar as my own handwriting. I pressed my lips tight, afraid a cry might escape me. How had they gotten here? Who had placed them under false names, asking fortunes for them while I sat at home believing the factory was drowning? I turned and nearly collided with a young woman carrying a brochure. She smiled politely. First time at the exhibition? I nodded, though words wouldn't come. She went on, gesturing to the displays. Magnificent, aren't they? Some of these are from rising houses in Europe. Others from exclusive ateliers right here in the States. Collectors pay a fortune for originals like these. Her words felt like blows. Rising houses, ateliers, fortunes. And yet those designs were my husband's. Our factories. I excused myself quickly, weaving back through the crowd. My knees shook as I reached the exit. Outside, the street noise rushed at me, harsh and real. My hands trembled as I held the railing, breathing hard, the world tilting slightly under my feet. All these years, I had believed my children when they said the factory was worthless. I had seen the ledgers, the red ink, the insistence that nothing good came from it anymore. And yet inside that hall I had seen proof. Our work lived on, admired, praised, and sold for prices beyond imagining. I walked aimlessly after that, past bakeries with golden loaves in the windows, past shopkeepers sweeping their steps. My reflection in a storefront glass startled me, an old woman with pale cheeks and eyes wide with something between grief and anger. By the time I returned home, dusk had settled. I sat at the kitchen table, the silence pressing close. The folder of liquidation paper still lay in the drawer, but I didn't reach for it. Not now. Instead, I pulled open another drawer, one that hadn't been touched in years. Inside were a few of my husband's old sketchbooks, edges frayed, pages smudged. I flipped through them slowly, tracing the lines of designs that had once felt like dreams. And now suddenly I knew. They hadn't vanished into dust and loss. They were out there, stolen, renamed, but alive. I closed the sketchbook with shaking hands. The exhibition had cracked something open. The question now wasn't whether the factory was worthless. The question was who had lied to me and why. And I intended to find out. The night after the exhibition, I couldn't sit still. I paced between the kitchen and the living room. My husband's old sketches spread out on the table. Each page seemed to glow with proof of what I had seen. The pendant, the bracelet, the earrings, every line matched. My children had told me the factory was worthless, but how could that be when strangers were selling those very designs for fortunes? The next morning I drove to the factory. The building looked the same as always. Weathered bricks, the old sign creaking in the breeze. The front door stuck as I pulled it open, like it always had, and the familiar smell of polish and metal dust hit me. It was quiet now, no hum of machines, just the hollow echo of my footsteps. In the office, dust coated the desks, but the filing cabinet stood firm. I pulled the drawers open one by one. Folders, invoices, receipts, rows of them stacked high. My hands shook as I flipped through. The numbers were neat, too neat. Every month showed losses, as if the factory had been bleeding for years. Rent overdue, wages barely covered, materials bought on credit. But something about it felt staged, like a play written for my eyes only. I pulled out a folder from 3 years ago, spread it beside one from last year. The handwriting was the same, every column perfect, almost copied. My husband's old accountant had written in a messy scrawl, but these numbers were crisp, uniform. Too clean. I carried a stack to the desk, sat down, and began making notes on a pad of paper. The totals didn't add up. Purchases listed twice, expenses inflated, and in the margins of one report I saw it. A faint imprint of another note, the kind you get when someone presses too hard with a pen. I held the paper against the light. Letters appeared, account numbers, bank names I didn't recognize. A chill ran down my back. I shoved more files into a bag and carried them home. At the kitchen table, I worked through them until my eyes blurred. Again and again I saw the same patterns. False expenses, missing income, payments diverted. Whoever had prepared these records had been covering something. The next morning, I decided to look closer at my children's lives. I started small. A phone call here, a glance there. My eldest, who had told me the factory was worthless, was suddenly driving a new car. A sleek foreign one that had no place in our modest town. His wife posted photographs of vacations in Paris and Rome, smiling with glasses of wine against glittering skylines. My daughter, who claimed she was struggling with bills, had quietly bought a house by the lake. The pieces fit together like a cruel puzzle. While I believed the factory was sinking, they had been pulling treasure from it, selling my husband's designs under different names, building lives I never knew about. I remembered the exhibition hall, the shimmering cases, the price tags with too many zeros. That money hadn't gone to strangers. It had gone to my own children. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window watching the street lamp flicker, the folder of liquidation papers still shut away in the drawer. My husband's sketches lay on the table, his handwriting looping across the margins. I ran my fingers over them, feeling as though he were there, urging me to see the truth. By morning I was certain. My children weren't protecting me. They weren't easing my burden. They were stealing, hiding, living double lives while telling me the factory was a ruin. I needed proof. Real proof, not just my suspicions. And I would find it. I didn't plan the words ahead of time. They came out of me raw like steam from a kettle too long on the stove. It was Sunday, and they had all gathered at my daughter's house for dinner. A roast sat on the table, wine glasses clinked, the air filled with talk of vacations and new furniture. I listened, quiet, until the weight inside me grew too heavy to hold. When the plates were cleared, I folded my napkin and said, "I need to talk to you." The room stilled. My eldest set down his fork, brows raised. My daughter leaned back in her chair, eyes cool, waiting. I looked at them one by one, my hands trembling under the table. I went to the exhibition downtown yesterday, I said. And I saw your father's designs. The vine pendant, the flower link bracelet, the leaf earrings. They were ours. They were his. For a moment no one spoke. Then my son gave a short laugh, sharp as glass. Mother, you must be mistaken. Lots of designs look alike. That's how jewelry is. No, I said firmly, my voice surprising even me. I know what I saw. I sat with him while he drew them. I watched him polish the first samples. Don't tell me I imagined it. My daughter sighed, pushing her plate away. Mother, you don't understand how the business works anymore. It's complicated. She hesitated, choosing her words like stones. You're too close to it. Too sentimental. Too sentimental? I echoed, heat rising in my chest. I saw those pieces being sold for prices that could have kept the factory alive for years. And yet you tell me it's drowning, worthless. They exchanged glances, quick and sharp. My youngest cleared his throat. Look, Mom, the factory isn't what it used to be. Times have changed. People don't buy like they once did. We've been protecting you from the stress. It's better if we close it down, take what little is left and move on. Protecting me? My hands gripped the edge of the table. Is that what you call it? Lying to me? Selling your father's work behind my back? The words landed heavy, but instead of guilt, I saw irritation flash in their eyes. My eldest leaned forward, voice low, as if soothing a child. Mother, you're tired. This is too much for you. You've always been emotional about the factory. We're just trying to handle it. Let us do this. I shook my head. No. You've been handling it for yourselves. The cars, the vacations, the houses, I know about them. Don't pretend it came from anywhere else. My daughter's lips tightened. This is exactly why we wanted you to sign the papers quickly. You're letting your imagination run wild. We can't drag this out, Mother. The factory's debts are growing by the day. I won't sign, I said, my voice steady now. Not until I know the truth. The silence that followed was colder than winter air. My children shifted in their seats, their polite masks cracking just enough for me to see the steel underneath. Finally, my son pushed back his chair. The scrape loud against the floor. You're making a mistake. A big one. You don't know what you're getting into. Maybe I don't, I said, standing too. But I know what I saw. And I won't be lied to anymore. I gathered my coat from the chair and walked toward the door. Behind me, their voices rose. Warnings, pleas, irritation, but I didn't turn back. Outside, the air was cool. The sky streaked with orange from the setting sun. My hands shook as I buttoned my coat, but my steps were firm as I walked down the path. For the first time since inheriting the factory, I felt something burn in me that wasn't confusion or fear. It was anger. And beneath that anger, resolve. They thought I was too old, too weak, too sentimental to fight. But they were wrong. This wasn't over. The night after that confrontation, the house felt strange, as though the walls themselves were listening. I couldn't shake the look on my children's faces, the irritation, the way they brushed me off like I was a child making up stories. I sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, the lamp burning low, staring at my husband's old sketches. The pages smelled faintly of graphite and time. He had trusted me with his dreams, and I had trusted our children to carry them on. Now that trust felt broken. I don't know what made me go to the study, a room I hadn't touched since he passed. His desk stood there under a cover of dust, the drawers stiff from disuse. I pulled one open and found pens, old invoices, a cracked ruler. Another drawer held nothing but yellowed envelopes. But then at the very back, hidden behind a loose board, I found a small brass key. My heart quickened. I knew what it belonged to. In the corner of the study stood his safe, A black box no bigger than a suitcase. It hadn't been opened in years. I carried the key in trembling hands, slid it into the lock, and felt the tumblers click. The door creaked open. Inside, neatly stacked, were folders tied with string, each marked in his handwriting. Beneath them lay a bundle of letters, their envelopes worn, the paper inside still crisp. I carried everything to the table, sat down, and began to read. The first folder held sketches, more detailed than the ones I'd seen before. Dozens of them. Rings, brooches, necklaces, each marked with notes about materials and finishes. Some I recognized, designs that had made it into production. Others were entirely new, drawings I had never seen, exquisite in their detail. The letters were from jewelry houses in New York, Paris, even Milan. They spoke of partnerships, contracts, promises of exhibitions. "Your designs show true artistry," one read. "We are prepared to discuss exclusive rights." Another spoke of negotiations for prices that made my head spin. These weren't the papers of a failing business. They were proof, undeniable proof, that the factory had immense value. My husband had been in talks with some of the most prestigious names in the industry. He must have been preparing for something bigger, something lasting. I sat there until dawn, letter after letter spread before me. My chest ached, but not from sorrow, from realization. The factory wasn't worthless. It had been stolen out from under me. When the morning light spilled through the window, I closed the safe again, tucking everything back inside. But I kept one sketch, a ring with interwoven lines and a sapphire at its center. I slipped it into my pocket, a reminder that I wasn't imagining things. Later that day, my eldest called. His voice was clipped, impatient. "Mother, we need you to sign those papers. The creditors are circling." I let him speak, let his words fill the silence. Then I answered, calm but steady. "I've decided. I won't sign." A pause. Then his voice sharpened. "You don't know what you're doing. You'll ruin us all." "No," I said. "You've already done that." And I hung up. My hands shook as I set the receiver down, but in my heart, something had shifted. They couldn't fool me anymore. I had proof now, sketches, contracts, letters, enough to show the world that this factory was not a burden but a treasure. That evening, I lit a candle in the kitchen, the way I used to when my husband worked late. The flame flickered, throwing shadows across the sketches spread out before me. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel lost. I had found the turning point. The morning after I found the safe, the house seemed alive with memory. The letters and sketches had changed everything. They were more than paper. They were my husband's voice, reaching across the years, telling me not to give in. But fear pressed in close. If I signed those liquidation papers, all of it, every sketch, every promise, every proof of his genius, would vanish into their hands. My children would finish what they had started, erasing his legacy while lining their pockets. I couldn't let that happen. I gathered the documents into a satchel, careful to tuck the most important ones in a separate envelope. My fingers trembled as I slid the safe shut again. For the first time in weeks, I locked the front door behind me and set out with a plan. The lawyer's office sat on the second floor of an old stone building downtown. The hall smelled faintly of wax and old books. Inside, a brass plaque read, "Harold Fincher, Attorney at Law." I had met Harold years ago, briefly, when my husband drafted the first will. He had a reputation in town, quiet, steady, the kind of man who didn't scare easily. I knocked. The secretary, a young man in a gray vest, led me into Harold's office. He sat behind a broad oak desk, silver hair combed neatly back, spectacles perched low on his nose. He rose when he saw me. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said warmly, extending his hand. "It's been a long time." I nodded, setting the satchel on the desk. "I need help, Mr. Fincher. I think my children are trying to trick me." He gestured for me to sit. "Tell me everything." I unfolded the sketches, the letters, the contracts, laying them out in careful order. I told him about the exhibition, the designs I recognized, the false ledgers. As I spoke, his brow furrowed deeper, his fingers drumming lightly against the desk. Finally, he leaned back. "You were right to come to me. These letters, this correspondence with international houses, it proves your husband's designs hold serious value. And these ledgers," he shook his head. "I've seen falsified books before. This has their smell all over it." My hands twisted in my lap. "If I sign the liquidation, it's all gone, isn't it?" "Yes," he said firmly. "You'd be surrendering the factory and everything tied to it. Your children would walk away with the assets, leaving you with nothing. But with this evidence, we can make a case. The courts will listen." I swallowed hard. "They'll fight me. They'll say I don't understand. They'll call me old and foolish." "They may try," he said. "But the law isn't on their side. What you've found changes everything." His calm voice steadied me. For the first time, I felt I wasn't alone. "Will you help me?" I asked. He nodded. "I'll represent you. But we must act quickly. If your children push forward with the liquidation, they could strip the assets before we stop them." He gathered the papers into neat stacks, sliding them into a folder. "Leave these with me. I'll have them copied and cataloged. For now, you keep this." He handed back the sapphire ring sketch I had carried in my pocket. "It might be useful later." I tucked it back into my bag, feeling its weight like a promise. On the way home, the streets looked different. The same shops, the same people rushing past, but I walked with a purpose now. I wasn't the woman hesitating over papers anymore. I was preparing to fight. That evening, my eldest son came by unannounced. He strode into the kitchen without knocking, his voice sharp. "Mother, we need those papers signed. We can't delay any longer." I stood by the stove, my hand steady on the kettle. "I've spoken to a lawyer," I said. His face changed, the color rising quick to his cheeks. "A lawyer? Why? There's nothing to fight about." "There is," I answered. "And I won't sign anything until the truth comes out." He slammed his hand against the table, the sound ringing through the room. "You don't know what you're doing. You'll destroy everything." I met his eyes. "No. I'll destroy the lies." For a moment, silence stretched between us. Then he turned, muttering under his breath, and stormed out, the door rattling on its hinges. When the house settled again, I poured the boiling water into my teacup, my hands finally trembling. But it wasn't fear alone, it was resolve. The next morning, Harold called. "I've filed the first motion," he said. "Your children will be served notice within the week. From here on, everything comes to light." I hung up the phone and sat by the window, the cup of tea cooling in my hands. Outside, children played on bicycles, their laughter drifting on the breeze. I thought of my husband, of the afternoons he came home with sketches in his pocket, hope in his eyes. This wasn't just about money. It wasn't even just about betrayal. It was about preserving what he built, making sure his life's work didn't vanish under false names and greedy hands. For the first time in months, I allowed myself a small smile. They thought they had cornered me. But I wasn't finished yet. This was only the beginning. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and ink. I had never been inside a courtroom before, not even as a visitor. Yet here I was at 69 years old, walking up the marble steps with my lawyer at my side, carrying my husband's sketches in a folder pressed tight to my chest. My children stood on the opposite side of the hall, clustered together in dark suits like a wall. They didn't look at me. My eldest spoke to their lawyer, a tall man with slick hair and a voice that carried even in a whisper. My daughter adjusted her necklace, the kind of expensive piece I now recognized as bought with factory money. The bailiff opened the doors and we filed inside. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my hands folded in my lap, while Harold arranged the evidence in neat stacks. The judge, a stern woman with sharp glasses, entered. Everyone rose. My knees trembled, but I stood tall. The proceedings began with their lawyer. He wasted no time in striking. Your Honor, this is not a matter of fraud or theft. This is a matter of family misunderstanding. My clients, the children of the late Mr. Caldwell, have been managing a failing business for years. Their mother, though well-meaning, is not equipped to understand the complexities of modern finance. We will also submit medical testimony regarding her declining mental fitness. I gripped the edge of the table, heat rushing to my face. They were calling me unfit, senile, unable to think. Harold rose calmly. Your Honor, the evidence will show otherwise. Not only is Mrs. Caldwell perfectly capable of managing her affairs, but her children have engaged in deliberate deception, falsifying financial records, siphoning profits into hidden accounts, and selling jewelry under false company names. We will present documents, witness testimony, and even proof from a public exhibition where Mrs. Caldwell recognized her late husband's designs being sold for exorbitant sums. The judge nodded, motioning for him to proceed. One by one, Harold laid out the sketches, the letters, the contracts. The courtroom projector displayed them on a screen. My husband's handwriting, his notes about materials, his correspondence with jewelers overseas. Then came the ledgers, the falsified expenses, the duplicated numbers. Harold spoke steadily, pointing to the discrepancies, explaining how the money had been siphoned. I watched the faces of my children. My eldest shifted uncomfortably. My daughter crossed her arms tighter. The youngest leaned forward, jaw clenched, refusing to meet my eyes. Their lawyer tried to object, but Harold was ready. He pulled out the photographs from the exhibition, the pendant, the bracelet, the earrings. These designs were created by Mr. Caldwell decades ago. Here they are today, sold under other names, at prices far beyond what the factory was ever said to earn. The profits were not lost. They were stolen. Whispers stirred in the gallery. I heard the rustle of papers, the sharp click of someone's pen. The judge leaned forward, studying the photographs, her eyes narrowing. Then came the moment I dreaded. Their attempt to paint me as incompetent. Their lawyer called a doctor to the stand, a man I had never seen before. He spoke of evaluations, of concerns about memory lapses. He said words like possible decline and not fully aware. I sat frozen, my hands gripping the sketch of the sapphire ring in my pocket. Harold rose for cross-examination. Doctor, he said, have you ever personally examined Mrs. Caldwell? The man hesitated. Not directly. I reviewed reports. Reports provided by her children? Yes. So you've never spoken to her? Never tested her memory? Never asked her a single question? The doctor's shoulders stiffened. No. Thank you. No further questions. Relief washed over me. Then Harold did something I didn't expect. He asked me to take the stand. I rose slowly, walked to the front, and swore the oath. My voice shook at first, but as I spoke, steadiness returned. I told the judge about the exhibition, the moment I saw the vine pendant, the flood of memory, the certainty of my husband's work. I told her about finding the safe, the sketches, the letters. I told her about the late nights at the factory, watching my husband work until his hands were raw. When Harold asked if I believed my children had betrayed me, I looked straight at them and said, yes. They have lived off lies while telling me the factory was dead. They've taken what was not theirs and tried to make me erase my own husband's legacy. The courtroom was silent except for the scratch of the clerk's pen. Their lawyer tried to shake me. Mrs. Caldwell, isn't it possible you misremembered those designs? That your grief colors your perception? I pulled the sketch of the sapphire ring from my pocket, held it up with both hands. Grief doesn't draw lines this straight. My husband did. And no one can erase that. The judge watched me for a long moment before nodding. By the end of the day, the evidence stood clear. The ledgers, the hidden accounts, the exhibition, my testimony. The defense looked thinner with each passing hour, their arguments fraying at the edges. As we left the courtroom, the air outside felt different, lighter, sharper. My children hurried down the steps ahead of me, their voices low and urgent. They didn't turn back. I paused at the top of the stairs, clutching the railing, breathing deep. For the first time since inheriting the factory, I felt the tide turning. The battle was far from over, but the truth was no longer buried. The second week of the trial began with a heavy gray sky. Rain tapped against the courthouse windows as if the heavens themselves wanted to see what would come of it all. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my papers neatly arranged, waiting for Harold to begin. My children were across the aisle, their lawyer whispering in their ears. They looked polished, confident. Too confident. Then Harold stood. "Your Honor," he said, "the plaintiff would like to call a new witness." A murmur spread through the courtroom. I hadn't known about this. My hands tightened in my lap as the doors opened at the back. In walked a man I hadn't seen in years. Thin now, hair grayer, shoulders bent with time. But I knew him at once. Samuel Peters. He had been one of our factory's craftsmen, steady and skilled, the kind of man who could set a stone so fine you'd swear it floated on air. He walked to the stand, his boots heavy on the floor. When he raised his hand for the oath, his voice was low but steady. "Mr. Peters," Harold began, "how long did you work at Caldwell Jewelry?" 32 years, Samuel said. "From the day it opened until the day it was shut down. And in that time, did you ever see evidence of the factory being as unprofitable as the defense claims?" Samuel shook his head. "No, sir. We weren't rich men, but we made enough. More than enough. Orders came in steady. Sometimes we worked late into the night to keep up." A ripple went through the room. My children shifted uncomfortably. Harold leaned closer. "Mr. Peters, can you tell the court what happened in the last few years of the factory?" Samuel's jaw tightened. "Things changed. We were told by the Caldwell children," he gestured toward the defense table, "to sign papers saying production was low, that profits weren't enough. They said it was just bookkeeping, nothing to worry about. But when we asked about the orders we knew had been filled, they told us to keep quiet." The judge leaned forward. "Are you saying you were instructed to sign false documents?" "Yes, ma'am," Samuel said firmly. "We all were. If we refused, they said we'd lose our jobs. Some men had families. They signed. I signed too. But I knew it wasn't right." My throat tightened. I remembered those men, their wives, their children. Honest people. Forced into lies. Harold spread a set of papers across the evidence table. "Your Honor, these are employment statements signed by factory workers, claiming lack of production. Notice how the handwriting varies, but the phrasing is identical. Mr. Peters, is this one your signature?" Samuel leaned forward. "Yes, that's mine." "And did you write the words above it?" "No," he said. "They gave us the forms pre-written. All we did was sign." The courtroom buzzed. My children's lawyer objected, but the judge overruled him. "Mr. Peters," Harold continued, "why have you come forward now?" Samuel looked across the room, and for the first time his eyes met mine. There was something almost apologetic in them. "Because it isn't right what they're doing to her. To Mrs. Caldwell. She stood by that factory with her husband. She deserves the truth, not lies." I swallowed hard, my vision blurring with tears I hadn't expected. The defense lawyer tried to discredit him, painting him as a bitter old man, resentful after losing his job. But Samuel didn't falter. He spoke simply, plainly, each answer striking like a hammer on steel. When he stepped down, he gave me the smallest of nods and I returned it. "An ally. After all these lonely weeks, I wasn't standing alone anymore. That evening, Harold and I sat in his office reviewing the day's progress. Samuel's testimony was powerful, he said, tapping his pen against his notes. The court will see this wasn't just financial mismanagement. It was fraud, deliberate and systematic. I thought of my children then, their polished clothes, their cold eyes. I remembered the nights I stayed up rocking them when they were babies, the meals cooked, the sacrifices made. How had we come to this? But I pushed the thought aside. There was no room for softness now. Before I left, Harold said, "Tomorrow we'll move to bank records. With Samuel's testimony and those accounts, the story is clear." I walked out into the rain, the air cool against my face. My umbrella shook in the wind, but I held it firm, the folder of sketches pressed close to my chest. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of strength that was more than just my own. I wasn't fighting alone anymore. By the third week of the trial, word had begun to slip past the courthouse walls. Reporters lingered on the steps each morning, notebooks in hand, their cameras flashing as we walked inside. At first, I kept my head low, clutching my coat tight around me. But soon the whispers grew into headlines. It started with a small column in the local paper. "Jewelry factory dispute turns ugly." By the next day it had grown. "Caldwell heirs accused of fraud." By the end of the week, national outlets had picked it up, calling it the jewelry factory betrayal. The courthouse was packed. Strangers filled the benches, some leaning forward eagerly, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Outside, vans from television stations parked along the curb, their antennas rising like watchtowers. Inside, Harold worked methodically. He presented the bank records, account numbers traced to shell companies, payments funneled overseas, properties purchased in names that weren't theirs. Piece by piece, the story unfolded. My children had been selling my husband's designs as if they were their own, hiding the profits while claiming the business was dead. When the documents flashed on the screen, the luxury cars, the foreign vacations, the lake house, I heard the gallery murmur. Some gasped. Others whispered words like unbelievable and disgrace. The defense lawyer tried to hold the line, but his voice sounded thinner now. He argued that business was complicated, that the accounts weren't proof of theft, that I was confused. But his words rang hollow against the weight of the evidence. And then came the moment I'll never forget. The judge called for a short recess. As I stepped into the hall, a woman approached me, microphone in hand, cameras trained on her. "Mrs. Caldwell," she asked, "how does it feel to learn your own children have been deceiving you?" For a moment I froze. My heart pounded. But then I lifted my chin and said steady and clear, "It feels like betrayal, but it also feels like justice is finally on its way." The words echoed louder than I expected. That evening they were on every news broadcast. My photograph appeared beside headlines across the country. People began writing letters, some to the courthouse, some to me directly. Strangers sent words of encouragement, telling me to stand strong, that I wasn't alone. The tide of public opinion turned sharply. My children had thought they could shame me into silence, but now the shame was theirs. Reporters dug into their lives, uncovering more than I had known. Luxury purchases, hidden assets, indulgences they had kept secret even from one another. By the time court resumed, the atmosphere had shifted. When my children walked in, whispers followed them like shadows. They avoided the reporters' questions, their faces tight, their eyes darting. Harold leaned close and whispered, "This is good. Public pressure makes it harder for them to maneuver." I nodded, though part of me ached. These were still my children. But each time I remembered the exhibition hall, the false ledgers, the signatures Samuel had been forced to write, my heart hardened again. The next witness was another craftsman from the factory, a younger man this time. He spoke of being ordered to shred original sketches, of being told never to mention certain designs again. His voice shook, but his words struck deep. By the end of the day, the judge called both counsels forward. She warned the defense to stop wasting time with baseless objections, her voice sharp as steel. My children sat rigid, their faces pale. Outside, the crowd had grown. People held newspapers, some even held sketches printed from the articles, pointing at them as I walked past. "We believe you," someone shouted. "Don't give up," another said. I clutched my coat tighter, tears pricking my eyes, not from weakness, but from something fierce rising inside me. For months I had felt alone, cornered, pushed into silence. Now the truth was no longer mine alone to bear. It was out in the world, undeniable. That night back home I spread the letters and sketches across the kitchen table once more. But this time I didn't feel fear. I felt strength. The world knew now. The lies had been dragged into the light. The great exposure had come, and it was only the beginning of justice. The final day in court arrived with a clear sky, the kind of morning that feels washed clean after a storm. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my hands folded around the sapphire ring sketch I'd carried through it all. Across the room my children whispered among themselves, their faces tight, drawn. The arrogance I'd seen at the start was gone. The judge entered, papers in hand. The gallery hushed. She adjusted her glasses and began to read. "This court finds that the financial records presented by the defense are falsified. The evidence provided by the plaintiff, original sketches, letters, contracts, and testimony from former employees, proves that Caldwell Jewelry is not a failed enterprise but one of significant value. Furthermore, the court rules that the children of Mrs. Caldwell engaged in deliberate deception and misappropriation of assets." I gripped the edge of the table as her words rolled on. "Therefore, full ownership of the Caldwell Jewelry Factory shall remain solely with Mrs. Caldwell. The defendants, the children, are hereby stripped of any rights to the business or its assets." Gasps filled the room. My children sat frozen, their lawyer bowing his head. I closed my eyes, tears sliding down my cheeks, not from sorrow but from release. The judge's voice softened as she delivered her final words. "Justice is not always swift, but in this case it is clear. Mrs. Caldwell, the legacy of your late husband remains in your hands." The gavel struck, sharp and final. Reporters surged forward as we left the courtroom, their questions a blur of noise. Cameras flashed, voices shouted, but I heard only one thing, Harold's steady voice beside me. "You did it," he said. "It's yours again." That evening I returned to the factory. The building stood quiet under the fading sun, its windows dusty, its doors stiff with disuse. I unlocked the front door, the hinges groaning, and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of polish and metal, ghosts of the past lingering in every corner. I walked slowly through the rooms, the benches where craftsmen once worked, the cabinets where stones were sorted, the polishing wheels still lined against the wall. Dust lay thick, but beneath it all, the heart of the place still beat. I could almost hear my husband's voice, telling me to imagine what could be. I made my decision there and then. I would not sell. I would not let this place become another line in a ledger. Instead, I would restore it. Not as a factory alone, but as a museum, a place where the story of his art could live on. A place where people could see not only the jewelry but the hands and hearts behind it. The weeks that followed were filled with work. Craftsmen returned, Samuel among them, eager to breathe life back into the old rooms. We scrubbed floors, polished glass, repaired benches. The town rallied too. Volunteers painted walls, neighbors donated display cases. Even the local paper ran a series on the history of Caldwell Jewelry. On the day the doors reopened, the air was filled with laughter and the smell of fresh flowers. Guests walked slowly through the halls, admiring sketches pinned beside the finished pieces. They marveled at the details, the artistry, the care. And when they read the plaque at the entrance, in honor of Thomas Caldwell, who believed every jewel held a story. Minnie wiped away tears. I stood quietly in a corner watching. Children pressed their faces to the glass, pointing at the sparkling pieces. Couples lingered over the displays, whispering about anniversaries and gifts. And in the back room where we had set up a small workshop, new apprentices bent over their benches, learning the craft. It wasn't just a museum. It was alive again. Sometimes people ask me if I regret fighting my children if the cost was too high. I think of the lies, the betrayal, the cold way they looked at me across the courtroom. The wound is real and it will always ache. But then I look around at what we saved, the sketches, the factory, the legacy, and I know it was worth it. As I lock the doors each evening, I whisper a quiet word to my husband, as if he still walks beside me. We did it, I tell him. They couldn't erase you. And though my children chose betrayal, I chose memory. I chose to fight for what was true. In the end, I didn't just reclaim a factory. I reclaimed myself. My dears, if in this story you saw yourselves, be sure to write about it in the comments. I would be very interested to read it. Thank you.